Hi guys, so in this video I'm going to be showing you how to achieve a crisp clean fondant finish just like this. Method of covering a fondant cake. We need two strips of fondant, one for the top and another for the side. Now for the top, we want to start out with a round fondant because we're working on a round cake and the top of our cake is round. This helps you achieve the round shape quickly. My cake is 8 inches, so I'm going to flatten this out until I achieve a round piece of fondant that is 8 inches wide, that is 8 inches in diameter. You want to make sure you have a measuring tape or a tape rule. I have a tape rule here. After I have flattened this out, I'm going to measure to make sure that I have an inch more than 8 inches, which is the actual size of my cake. So I have 9 inches here, so I think I'm good to go. You don't want to have a very thin fondant. If your fondant happens to be too thin, you will struggle to get a clean finish from your cake. So make sure that while you're trying to widen or flatten your fondant to the diameter of your fondant isn't too thin. If it's too thin, you might need to get more fondant and then go over the whole process from scratch. So for this, I think this thickness is perfect. So at this point, I'm going to use my cake smoother. This is a plastic cake smoother. You can buy this in any cake supply store around you. I'm going to use it to flatten the top, and this step is very vital because this takes away imperfection that might be at the top of your fondant, because once it's on your cake you might not be able to put in that much effort and pressure into the fondant. So you want to give it a head start. If you look closely, you will notice that there are serious changes. Now when placing this on your cake, you want to make sure it is centered and you don't want to have too much overhang. So make sure you have just an inch more than the diameter of your cake. It helps to have an extra board in hand when working on a fondant cake using paneling method, because we're going to be flipping. Now you want a board that is at least 2 inches bigger than the size of your cake, most likely the size of the board the cake is sitting on. I'm going to flip this cake onto this board, and before I do that, I'm going to add some cornstarch to the top of this fondant to make sure that it doesn't stick to the board. So I'm going to place this right on it and then I'm going to flip. After I have flipped, I'm going to take off this bottom board and place it aside while I bring in my turntable. Now this turntable helps make this whole cutting process a lot easier. I'm going to be cutting the excess fondant that you can see hanging at the side of this cake. Now one thing to note when cutting your fondant, because this stage is what would give you your sharp edge or not, you want to make sure you cut straight along the same side of the cake. You don't want to cut into the edge of the cake or out. You want to make sure that your knife lies right where the cake stops. Make sure your knife is straight. You want it to lean against the cake like this. Now you can go as many times as you need to until the piece of fondant you have here is flush with the level of your cake. You want this fondant under to be just as wide as your cake is. So at this point, you want to set your cake aside and work on the fondant for the body of this cake. When we were working on the top of the cake, we worked with a round fondant because the top of the cake is round. Now the sides of this cake, we want to work with a rectangular sheet of fondant. It helps to start out with a log of fondant that is slightly rectangular in shape, and of course you want to knead your fondant to make sure it's pliable before you go ahead. You can see that we have a log shaped fondant. It helps to start out with a fondant that is this shape because we are going for a long strip of fondant that isn't very tall. So when you start to flatten it, you flatten it towards the height and then you widen it towards the width. You need to make sure you measure the circumference of your cake. So basically, you take a tape rule, you go all around the cake like this. Here we have 25 inches, but I'm going to add an extra inch just to be safe. We're going to flatten out this fondant to 26 inches wide And then for the height, you also want to measure the height of your cake from the point where the board stops to where the cake stops, and that's 6 inches. So we're going for 26 inches in width and 6 inches in height. For every time you flatten your fondant, you want to make sure that you apply constant. Be generous with it because this would help your fondant come off your box surface after you have flattened it out. I think at this point you can measure to see what we have. I believe we should have 26 inches. Yep, we have more than 26 inches. This is 27. So at this point, just like we did for the top piece of fondant, we want to use this cake smoother to smoothen the top to make sure that every imperfection goes away. And then this also takes away dents, because in the process of flattening it, you might have like your fingerprint on it, your rolling pin might have left some impressions, but this completely takes off all that and gives you a very smooth top. And while you walk, you would even feel the difference because it gets really smooth, like a slide. It's amazing. Okay, so we want the length of this fondant to be an inch more than the actual circumference of your cake. If the circumference of your cake is 25 like mine, measure this to 26 inches just so you have an extra inch to spare, and you will understand why while we go. You want to cut the sides of your fondant, and before you do that, it's important to measure. So now I have started from 0. I'm going to mark where that starts and then mark where it ends. Here we have 26, and after doing that, I'm going to cut a straight line. You need to make sure that you can cut straight or work on cutting straight. If you can't cut straight, you can get a metal ruler to help trace the line. So now we have the required length. For the width, we want to measure. I think here we have more than we need. We have 8 inches on every side. So it's important to make sure that you cut one side very straight, because that's the side that is going to lap with the piece of fondant that you've already placed on top of your cake. This part of your fondant is very important, because this is what's going to appear as your sharp edge when you flip your cake over. So please make sure that this line is as straight as you can get it to be. I have my fondant looking all pretty. So now you want to pick your cake and place this around your cake. But before you do that, use your paintbrush with a little water along the fondant under your cake. Just that strip alone. Make sure your brush does not have more water than you need. You just want your brush to be damp, because you don't want residue of water hanging under your fondant. Like, you don't want that at all. Now this water is what's going to help this second strip of fondant to stick with the one that's already on your cake. You want to lift this piece of fondant and place it, like basically wrap your cake with it, making sure that the sharp end you cut laps with the sharp end that's already on this cake. Now, if you notice, the sharp end is just flat against my board. You don't want it to overhang or to bend. You want it to be straight. The moment you have secured it on, you want to use your cake smoother to finish up the process. This overhang right here is the reason we want to make sure that when we flatten out the length of our fondant, we have an extra inch for the length. I am pushing down. I'm pushing down my fondant to make sure that it closes any gap that might be between this last strip of fondant and the first one that was placed initially. You want to make sure it closes up any space. So you want to push down and then press against the cake to secure your fondant to your cake smoothly. When cutting here, you want to make sure you cut a straight line, And you want to make sure you cut into the two strips of fondant at the same time, like this. Once you take out what's inside, it closes clean because it's like a missing piece in the puzzle. But before you close it up, it's important to apply a little water on one part of it, just one part. And then you place your fondant just side by side, and then you close it with your cakes mortar. The moment you've succeeded in closing this up, you want to work it with your smoother to try to make sure that the seam vanishes. It's totally fine if your seam doesn't vanish, as long as your line is straight. After all that is done, you want to cut the excess fondant on the top of your cake, which is going to be the bottom eventually. What you need to do is you want to make sure you use the top of your cake as a guide. You want to cut. While you cut, I'm starting here where it's already cut, so it gives me a clean cut. Now, you don't want to keep going back and forth like this. If you go back and forth like this while you move, you will end up with a very rough edge. So what you simply want to do is keep your knife at an angle on a straight line, and then you move your cake. Can you see that? You have a clean cut. You don't want to keep going back and forth. Make sure your knife is straight. If you bend your hand this way, you end up cutting it more than you should. And if you raise your hand beyond the surface of this cake, you will end up having like an overhang when you flip your cake. So make sure you cut it to exactly the height of your cake, and you just want to move your knife. The top again. This step really does make a whole difference. And while you do this, make sure that you have enough cornstarch under your fondant, or it could stick and then you have to start from scratch. Now, for this board, we're going to apply just a little bit of water. We don't want the water dripping off the board. We just want enough to make this piece of fondant stick to this board. You want to use your rolling pin to lift your fondant. This helps. I think I have some errors here. And then you place it right on top. And you secure it with your hand first. And then you take your smoother and finish it off. So I'm securing this and I'm bending a little towards the end to form a mark. So at this point, you're going to cut the excess fondant that is hanging out from this board. So I like to lift it up like this and cut. And that's how we cover our board with fondant. Now, we want to make sure we stick this board to the bottom of this cake. And you can do that using buttercream, royal icing, or chocolate ganache, whichever one you have handy. So what you basically want to do is you take your palette knife, you place the cream in the middle, just in the middle, and spread it. Make sure it is flat so that when you place this board on it, it doesn't lift up your cake. You want it to be flush against the cake. So you place your prepared board on top of the cake. So what I do is I step down a little bit and I check to make sure it's centered while turning my turntable. If I need to adjust it at some point, I adjust it. And once I'm comfortable with what I have, I flip. Now you want to have really strong hands and be very careful because you don't want to lose your cake in the process of flipping. Then you reveal your clean, sharp edge. Now this is perfectly okay as is. If you want to take it up a notch, here's one easy thing you can do. You want to take another lump of fondant, knead it properly until it is pliable. You want to make sure you flatten it out very, very thin. Now, if you do not have a good fondant recipe, you might struggle with this step. You need a very good fondant recipe that actually stretches out without breaking. While you're at it, make sure that you're flouring your surface because your fondant is likely to really stick. I'm going to cut off any excess that might be here. Now the cake is 8 inches, but this board is 10 inches, so I'm just going to cut around the board. Water to the surface of your cake, because this is what's going to stick this fondant to your cake. But before that, make sure you get rid of any excess cornstarch that might be on the surface. And when you're done with that, you apply just a little water. Like I said before, you don't want dripping water on your cake, you just want a moist brush, enough to stick another strip of fondant. You probably already guessed, we need to flip one more time. A lot of flipping going on here. Chim. And then I like to push down a little with my cake mortar so that this fondant laps with the new strip of fondant that I have on top. Just a little pressure would go a long way here. Make sure it sticks. And after you're done with that, you take your knife, craft knife, and then you cut off the excess. Make sure your knife is straight against your cake. As long as you follow the steps that I have showed you in this video very carefully, you're going to achieve a very clean cake, even cleaner than this one. So if you have any questions, if you have comments, please do leave your comments in the comment section.